You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Kenneth Brower is an American environmental writer and has written a number of books about the environment, national parks, and natural places. He authored the series The Earth's Wild Places, which was published by Friends of the Earth in the 1970s. His most widely read book on Yosemite is in over 1,200 WorldCat libraries. Many of his books have been published by the National Geographic Society, and several have been translated into Japanese, German, Spanish, and Hebrew. Ken is the oldest son of the late environmentalist David Brower, founder of several organizations such as Friends of the Earth and Earth Island Institute, and also served as the first executive director of the Sierra Club. Point Reyes National Seashore is a prominent cape and popular Northern California tourist destination on the Pacific Coast. It is located in Marin County, approximately 30 miles northwest of San Francisco. Ken grew up an advocate for Point Reyes since his father, then executive director of the Sierra Club, was instrumental in Kennedy signing National Seashore authorizing legislation. Today, Point Reyes is at risk from a threat no one expects to exist in a national seashore or any national park. So before we get started, we're here to talk about a very serious issue. I have to start with something a little bit less serious, a lot more fun probably for most people when they're thinking about what we're about to talk about. And that is, I've read your book, Wildness Within, and I think I snuck it off Dave Foreman's shelf before a river trip some years ago. But I doubt most people will bring up what I consider one of the most important pieces of writing in modern conservation history, and that is On the Power of the Sierra Club Cup in Sierra Magazine. And
Yeah.
I don't know if you even remember even writing such an article.
I do remember writing it. And of course, I remember Sierra Club Cups, having grown up with them.
Yeah. I just love that article. So thanks for writing it.
Well, you're welcome. I'm loyal to the cup. I did a story for National Geographic in Wrangell St. Elias, and the guide who took me and the photographer around that country refused to allow us to bring Sierra Club cups. He hated Sierra Club cups, because of course they're horrible cups. They burn you and they get cold quickly. But you can't tell that to an old Sierra Club hand. And so I got kind of indignant, but I did as he said. I brought a non-Sierra Club cup.
Grudgingly against your religion, really.
Against what my dad used to call the religion. Yep.
Yeah. I think Dave described at one point, and I don't know if this is actually true, but your dad draping a whole steak over that cup and not being able to see the cup anymore. And that may have been one of those embellishments, but I can't get that picture. I've never been able to get that picture out of my head because I've heard other people tell the story about the darn Sierra Club cup. And I always remember Dave's telling of his experience with that.
I think I may even be in the John McPhee book on my dad, the steak draped over the cup. My dad he admired Dave as much as anybody he knew, and in a way, Dave took over that. My dad's sort of a radical position in the movement, and the story that he used to tell all the time is Russ Train, who was the Secretary of Interior for Nixon, was sort of a friend and an enemy. And he said once, thank God for Dave Brower, he makes it so easy for the rest of us to appear reasonable. And my dad just loved that. He took that as a compliment. And he said, now we have Dave Foreman to make me look unreasonable. Now, after this, we've got to find somebody to make Dave Foreman look unreasonable. And that was his idea of how important unreasonableness is in lack of compromise and sticking to your principles is in this movement.
I've found few people more unreasonable than Dave. It's a tall order right out of the gate.
Yeah, we may not find anybody. It doesn't look like we will at this point.
We're still looking. I've tried, but it doesn't work for me.
We're not growing them like we used to, and that's one of the things that needs to change.
Yeah. Well, and especially issues like we're here to talk about today, the Point Reyes and the grazing. Maybe you could give a little information about how you're attached to that, and also enlighten people who don't know that grazing can even take place in a national park in this country, because that could be a surprise to a lot of people.
Well, my starting point really was a picture of my I found of my dad at the signing as JFK signs the enabling legislation for this park into law in September of 1962, and it's a great old Abbey Row White House photographer photograph. My dad's on the far right, and on the far left is Wayne Aspinall, who is one of his arch enemies, but who delayed the wilderness bill for about 4 years, succeeded in not voting on it in Congress because he was the chairman of the Interior Committee. But anyway, I started with that, and I just remember that day and what a hopeful time it was. And there is grazing this park, and it was a stopgap measure. It was never intended to be permanent. It was a way they couldn't buy all the land they needed to when they established the park. This was a way of making a transition period for the ranchers themselves, for the county and its lack of tax base. But there's a myth that's grown up. It's been propagated by the ranchers of the park, and it's that ranching is integral to this idea of this park. And it was meant to be here forever. And the history is just the opposite. They didn't want the park. None of the people who proposed it wanted it forever. But we now, inside the park, have a contingent of politically astute ranchers who are swaying the future of the park. And the thing that kicked the latest controversy off was half the elk in the elk reserve in the northern end of the peninsula. Half the elk died in the drought of 2012 to 2014. They were cut off from water by a high elk-proof fence that the Park Service built to mollify ranchers. So this enraged Huey Johnson, a great environmentalist we have in Marin County, and former head of the Nature Conservancy and founder of the Aldo Leopold League and the Trust for Public Lands and the Grand Canyon Trust. And he was outraged and went to court, sued the Park Service for elk neglect and for not having updated their general management plan as they were required to do for 36 years, and for never having made a study of the impact of ranching on this park. The court refused to dismiss it, and the Park Service settled. So now they've come up with a future in which their preferred alternative, as opposed the various alternatives, were to have the status quo. Alternative A, alternative F was to remove ranching. Well, they picked their preferred alternative B, which is to give 20-year leases to the ranchers to allow them to expand their agriculture, not reduce it, to expand it to include row crops and move from cattle to goats, pigs, hogs, and chickens, and to build B&Bs and retail stands in the park. And it guaranteed them, if this passes, if the Park Service does go with their alternative B, it guarantees ranchers that elk, the native elk of this peninsula, will be culled in favor of cows. So wow. It's turned normal park principles upside down, and this is really what we're worried about and working against.
That is worse than I actually thought. I can't believe that list of things that you just rattled off. That they also. I was just talking to Michael Kellett, who has a list of about 500 places that deserve consideration for new national parks throughout the country, which was a shock to me. I'm like, 500? Because I was worried about what a national park is in the eyes and memory of this country outside of what you just mentioned and talked about. National parks are sacrosanct. They are supposed to be the pinnacle and one of the best things that this country has ever done in its history. For people to hear what you just said, and this is the same National Park Service that's in charge of everybody else's favorite national parks, wherever they may be. This is a shock. How in the world could they get it so wrong? Or maybe how powerful is the ranching community if they can do something like this with national parks? They do it with wilderness. They do it with BLM land and Forest Service land ad infinitum with no power. Nobody can really intercede there. But here, this is a national park. How can this even be?
Yes, I think it's partly because you do have a contingent, a sort of fifth column of ranchers inside the park who don't understand park principles or don't care about them. It's what you have in Point Reyes National Seashore is two different disparate ideals of land stewardship facing off. It's production versus preservation, and and this park for its whole history has had this split personality. And these ranchers are very effective, and they're advocates. The California Farm Bureaus, they have people on their side.
Yeah.
The extraordinary thing to me about this has been what you mentioned about BLM land and National Forest Service land and the fights there. Um, what's fascinating to me is that this is what we're talking about is Marin County, California. This is the hot tub capital of the world. It's the second most affluent county in the nation.
Yeah.
It's the land of Porsches and Maseratis and yoga and Pilates and recycling. And yet, in this county, there's a tremendous number of people who are willing to see the Park Service as being the feds and being bullying the little rancher, and who accept sort of this rancher romance. And it's just extraordinary to me that everything we talk about in Intermountain West, in the sagebrush rebellion country, the things that Bernard DeVoto talked about in the 20s and 30s, the power of the stockmen in the West, the disproportionate power to influence the politics of the West, the whole Bundy mentality that these people who lease public lands always think of it as their own, and do not understand that they're on public lands, do not understand in the case of this national seashore that they have to share it with wildlife. So it's all sort of it's the last place I would have thought this kind of the last place I thought you'd see the sagebrush rebellion sort of flare up. It makes me realize how we've sort of lost the idea of wilderness. It was always a hard sell. Howard Zahniser of Wilderness Society and my father, who helped him with the language, he was the author of the Wilderness Bill, which became the Wilderness Act. They had to work a long time to get this idea across the American people. It's not part of our tradition. It's the Mississippi of American culture is going the other way. It's going to exploitation. This idea of saving some landscape was novel, and it wasn't an easy sell. And it took them about 8 years of Sierra Club wilderness conferences, which functioned as kind of think tanks, to get the idea, the language for the idea in place, and to get a constituency for it. And I think we forget that we have to. I think we have to go win that battle again, because it's one of the alarming things about this development in Point Reyes is how good environmentalists who are not of the tree-hugging variety don't get it now. They call themselves environmentalists, but they don't understand this idea of saving something for itself. Good people like Michael Pollan, for example, was against making Drake's Estero in the park a wilderness. He wanted an oyster farm there. He's a food person. Alice Waters, our great Berkeley restaurateur, Chez Panisse. She's the sort of the queen of California cuisine. She started edible schoolyards and stuff. She's so great on food, but she wanted this oyster farm in the middle of the Drake's Estero in the middle of the park. So we need to re-educate folks because I think this is a hard idea for Americans to get, and I think they lose it easily. So we've got a lot of work to do.
That is a really good point. And we often get into discussions on this podcast about why whatever we're talking about seems so hard. People to either understand, or a bill to get passed, or things to get introduced, or rules to change. And you bring up a really excellent point that I think maybe the conservation community as a whole has taken for granted, that everybody knows what we know. We've already done this. We already told people what wilderness is. We've already made people really appreciative of national parks and protected lands of all kinds. Why should we have to do that again? And I'm only asking that right now because we can't get the simplest. We can't get past step one. Like, there shouldn't be any grazing in a national park or seashore. Like that should just, and everybody should just know that. I expected everybody to know that. But you're right. It's, if I was a betting man and you said, give me the biggest slam dunk of something getting completely refused and pushed away, and you can pick any place in the country, I would pick Point Reyes. Because demographically and everything else, just like you said, there's no reason it should be.
I think you're right. My dad had a line that may be pretty obvious, but he used it a lot. He said they only have to win once. They being the exploiters, the extractive industries, the miners, the loggers, the ranchers. They only have to win once. We have to win every time. And I sort of extend that now to mean we have to keep this education up. I think I had the same problem you do. I'm a writer. I talk to, biologists who are in the field working on these problems. I deal with people who understand the wilderness principle, understand what these places mean and what they're for. But this episode in Point Reyes reminded me that so many people don't, and it is not a natural thing for Americans. We still are sort of enthralled to this myth of the frontier a little bit, and the idea that the land has to be beaten back and has to produce. There's so many people think, well, why not have an oyster farm in there? Why not have it produce something? What's the point of having this land locked up, as they used to always say? And I think we just need to re-educate. We just need to get the idea out there again. In the books my father and I used to do for the Sierra Club, we always had a section called the idea section, which was just to broach this idea again in every book of what we're talking about, what Aldo Leopold was talking about, what Dave Foreman is talking about. Why these places are important. They're an example of how the world works without man. They're a laboratory. They're a place where we can learn from our mistakes. They're a place where, and above all, they're a place that be important for themselves, for the animals that live there, with no relation to our benefit. And these are ideas that just need to be promulgated again.
You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Did you know we also publish insightful and inspirational content from leading rewilding scholars, poets, artists, and organizers from around the world? You can visit rewilding.org and sign up for our weekly digest to receive brilliant, fresh insights on everything rewilding. You'll find over a decade of articles and news from the front lines of wildlands protection and all kinds of restoration efforts. Check us out at rewilding.org, and don't forget to share it with friends. If you look at what people are talking about out on social media when they're doing their action alerts, when they're talking about their issues, they're not using very easy fodder for their arguments because they don't know it exists. They haven't read Sand County Almanac, maybe some of them ever. Like, I think we really are taking that for granted when we get frustrated that people aren't understanding the next level of issues. Now, combine that with the fact that the other side's favorite pastime is rewriting history. So while it's eroding from our end because we might not be doing that education as much as we should be, and making sure that the younger people coming up have that really good foundation. But at the same time, the other side loves to rewrite history. They're picking away at it and saying, no, it wasn't really what Brower said it was. It's this. This is what wilderness means. It should be used. There should be oysters in it and everything else. And with those two combined, it creates a perfect storm to probably predict that we would be where we are today with issues like Point Reyes.
No, I agree. Part of this may be that everybody is in their screens, and who do people get out in the wilderness enough anymore? I got, and maybe you too, got imprinted early by this, but that needs to happen. People need to get out in it. People are ready for it. So, my experience with everybody I've known, inner city kids that I've taken to Point Reyes over the years, instantly get it. They tell me, I've people who've come back to me, black kids that came out there 60 years ago. They say, Ken, do you remember that day we went to Point Reyes? What E.O. Wilson calls, we're programmed for this. Biophilia. It's where we grew up. We evolved in wilderness. It wasn't, way before agriculture, way before fire even probably. That's where we started. And it's home. And people are ready for it, I think, when they see it. But we need to get them into it more. And when you talk about rewriting history, there's no more wonderful example of what's happening in Point Reyes right now. Number one, there's this myth that the ranchers were intended to be there forever. There's even this myth that they were the prime movers in establishing the park. That it was at their behest that the government acted, which is the opposite of the truth. They fought it tooth and nail in the beginning. But the rewriting of history there. For example, the idea that cattle are good for landscape. You have a lot of people who say this. Oh, well, they graze off the unfavorable, the exotic weeds, the invasives. Well, it's just completely untrue. Anybody who knows anything about the history of the West knows they've been a disaster for our public lands. Riparian zones, for sage hens, for any number of things. They're terrible. They're a terrible use of the landscape. They're inefficient use of water and of land, and they ruin landscape. So, but this myth is, and you'll see scholars now. You'll have scholars sort of enthralled to the myth of the ranch, saying of ranching, and saying that cattle actually are good for the land. So we're up against this fake news and this rewriting of history. In fact, Point Reyes, the prime greenhouse gas emission, according to the Park Service in Point Reyes, is methane from the either end of a cow. It's not the exhaust from 2.5 million visitors every year. It's cows. They're primarily contributing to climate change in that park. Is that the kind of, the example we want our national parks to hold? The water, some of the most polluted streams are in the western slope of Point Reyes National Seashore. The park superintendent every year has to help ranchers get waivers from compliance with the Clean Water Act. Is that the kind of thing we want our park superintendent to be doing? What effect is that having on her morale? She knows what her correct job as a superintendent of a national park is. What happens to her when she has to do this kind of venal work? The biomass of cattle on the planet is twice that of humanity. Do we need more cattle in our national parks? It's just nuts.
I don't want to be a downer, but there's so much work to be done that it seems, going backwards to think that we have to provide that lack of education when everybody had thought everybody was caught up, while we're also fighting current issues. But I think the hopeful part of that is that it's the reason, probably one of the biggest reasons, that we are fighting the current issues such as they are, because that education hasn't been there, and it may not have been transferred to the next generation properly, as well as our elders would have liked. And as you talk, I just keep coming up with examples of battles and issues raging around the country that are not being fought with all of the ammunition that we have. And the other guys, man, I hate to say this, but there's probably some other guys on the other side who know the history better than a lot of people on our team and know how to take advantage of that. And they win a lot.
Yeah, but it's always been a hard swim up the current of this society, and it was never easy from the beginning. And as you say, you're probably right. We probably shouldn't have to do this education all over again, but we better. Because we're losing on the idea front. And one of my thoughts is that we don't have enough of the guys who are the religion guys. My dad used to call it the religion. Environmentalism makes a very good religion. You worship creation as opposed to the creator. The creator's a sort of a tricky, elusive character but creation is right there, and you can see it, and you can smell it and taste it and hear it, and that was what my father's, the sort of salvation of creation was what he was up to. But it was a passion. And I think one of the things that we have now is sort of technocrats in the movement. People who are good at probably good in Washington getting things through. And we don't have the guys that are the guys with a voice, the Thoreaus, or even Teddy Roosevelt, or people like my dad, or people like Dave Foreman, who would get Arione and say, I ever saw him talk to howling like a wolf at the end, as I'm sure you've seen. But we need that type again, the guys who can use the language and have passion. And I've seen some of these old guys are still around. Once Ralph Nader gets warmed up, he flames. We need people who can, like Foreman and like my dad, who, after they talk to a college audience, have people trooping down the aisle to sign up, and remembering that this is a cause. It's not a profession so much. It's a cause, and we need more of that, because I suppose a good example is what happened to Dave Foreman at the Wilderness Society, and how it went from a real good grassroots outfit that fought hard, got taken over by sort of a money guy, and this is the other thing that's happened is is too much corporate influence on boards. Got to raise funds now, but at the same time, too much corporate influence just changes the frame of mind on these boards, and you don't get the kind of daring and risk taking that the old guard used to do at the birth of this movement. The birth of the movement is recent, and there was there's a kind of a freshness to anything that's newborn that's got to fade, but we've got to try to pump that freshness back in.
Yeah, I wonder about that corporate influence. I wonder if the exception, if you would consider Patagonia the Dave Foreman of corporations. They seem to have a good influence and let people do what they need to do without messing with their mission too much. Is all corporate influence, and I know the majority is, but is all of it bad?
No, Patagonia is great, and Yvon Chouinard is, who comes from the same tradition. He started like my old man as a climber, and he's great, and what they've done there is tremendous. And so there are examples of corporate responsibility in this area. They're just too few.
Right. Way
and
too
it
few.
really is an area we have to. My dad used to say, until we get this stuff mainstreamed, until we get the corporate world sort of imbued with this ethos, it's not going to work, because this is what makes our society work. And if we don't get business engaged, it's not going to happen. So it's another thing we have to do. As you say, it's a lot of work, but it's always been like that. We got to just roll up our sleeves and do it. Get more Patagonias out there. Ray Anderson's outfit, his carpets was great, and there are a few of these people who really mean it. And there's some sign that with recognition of climate change that more people are going. More people in the corporate world are serious about it, recognizing that the climate change threatens corporations.
When current CEOs of corporations were just kids, would have been a perfect opportunity for them to have that moment, that defining moment that so many people can point to, where they started to form their conservation ethic, their land ethic, and the second best time for that to happen would be now. And we can't stop. And we shouldn't probably also mythologize the people who came before us as if it was a cakewalk for them, for your dad, for Sennheiser, for everybody, that they really were awfully hard workers. That's one of the things that's a thread through all of the interviews I've ever heard with Dave is somebody will allude to how hard working he was and how driven he was and how he kind of got everybody else welled up in that orbit when they were in his presence.
Were you talking about your Dave Foreman, which that would be true with, or my father, Dave Brower?
Your dad and Foreman.
Yeah.
Those guys both worked their butts off.
I've never known anybody who just worked every moment. It was tough on my mom. It was tough on the kids sometimes because he traveled, maybe 70% of the time to talk and lobby. But I've never known anybody work so hard. And he had enormous physical energy. And I've always wondered how it worked, whether a passion generated the energy or the physical energy was just physiological, and it found its way into environmental action. But whatever it was very hard work. And as I say, Zani and Sennheiser and my dad, when they were getting the Wilderness Act together, it was calculated. It was they said, we've got to get these wilderness conferences going to get the language, to get people engaged, and to sort of establish an agenda. And they worked, about 8 years at that. And so it's not easy.
There are people like you who are carrying this flag forward, and your writings, you're getting ready to publish something about the Marshall Islands, and I'm sure that writing is going to be imbued with principles that we learned for your dad and so many others. And that's going to be a different book about the Marshall Islands than most any other book would be.
It is, and it is my father, there was no audience too small for my dad. Even his 4 little kids at the dinner table, he was always evangelizing. There was no way we could escape this message. It wasn't just that we were brought to the wilderness of the Sierra when we were, 5 and 6 years old, but it was because we were introduced to this idea, the idea of wilderness, and the idea of the importance of unspoiled natural world. That does animate everything I do. I think all my ideas sort of came from my old man, and it's sort of in a way. I grew up in Berkeley during the People's Park and the Mario Savio movement and all that stuff. I couldn't quite get engaged because I really believe that the more important movement was this one, My dad used to say that it's the one cause that has to succeed. We can muddle through with everything else. We can probably muddle through with less than perfect social justice and women's rights and civil rights, but we have to have a planet to live on. If we don't get that right, then nothing else succeeds. And I believe that. I believe it's a very important cause, and it's among a lot of progressives today. I think it takes second or third place to like social justice. I don't think that's the way we should look at it. I think social justice is dependent on it. We're going to see an awful lot of social injustice if climate change goes the way it looks like it's going. We're going to see an awful lot of mass migrations of people here and elsewhere. And as we get more and more crowded, we're going to get more and more autocratic. That's the way it works. So democracies don't work so well when they get completely jammed with people.
I just got little jolts thinking this feels like losing a language. Almost also that we're in danger of losing a culture that was developed that we all didn't even know was in danger.
Yeah, I think you're right. This is one of the things that I'm concerned with in this Marshall Islands book I'm doing. I've done 4 books on Micronesia, and it's a place I love. Marshalls are all coral atolls. They're all going to go under, and they're a wonderful culture, and it's a wonderful system. The coral reef is the second most diverse ecosystem on the planet, and it's all at risk now. So yeah, what you say is right. Rewilding is what we need to do, and the reason is that natural systems manage themselves way better than we do. Every time we try, we mess it up. I mean, every time. The history of our hubris and trying to think we can manage nature. We always screw up.
It is also a very easy thing, I think, for people to understand when you just say nature knows best. Nature always, everybody would agree with that. Nature knows best, except for people who think that, wolves don't belong around their elk because they want to hunt more elk and they think less wolves equals more elk, despite the chronic wasting disease.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's one of the things that the right wing has done much better than the progressive wing of our politics. And that was because they lost so much. They had so many Democratic presidents. They actually sat down and worked out a strategy. And all this money went into think tanks, and they came up with the language. And I think it may be actually trickier to come up with a language than we think, because it needs to reach across to people who are less familiar with nature than we are, and finding language is going to be important because, for example, we have a lot of resistance now from right-wing evangelicals. Well, what we're talking about is salvation of creation, of the Lord's work. We need to make that argument better. This is what we're about, really. This was the gift we were given on this planet, and we've been trashing it. And it's I would say, a duty of a Christian or any religious person to maintain creation. This is an argument we've begun to make, and there was some strides. It's fallen off a little lately, but we need to get evangelicals on our side.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem so hard to get evangelicals on your side, given present situations I won't mention. But I mean, yeah, and it is something. It's a re-education on their part. Another part of history that's been rewritten is exactly what the Bible says about creation. And they've just bastardized that stewardship thing completely to death. But it has been, because it's been repeated so many times, it is now the general understanding, I think, of most Christians is that we're on top and nothing else is as special as us. We're exceptional, and everything else is our flock and ours to do with what we want.
It's true. I mean, it was one of my dad's lines. And he was just stunned when he learned it. It was not till fairly late in his life that the correct translation of Aramaic in the Bible for this word that we call dominion, which is stewardship, which is the opposite of dominion. It's responsibility to take care of it as opposed to master it. And this is a huge, as you say, this is a huge semantic difference. And it would be a great thing to bring home to people. And I think people would respond to it. Nobody, dominion is, mastery over something as opposed to stewardship of it. Yeah, make sure people understand what the language really means. So many people have the view that environmentalists are exaggerating, that they're chicken littles, and it's people who are just not looking around them, because look what's happening. I mean, the place is burning up and it's flooding. The people don't really get how grave this is. Nobody was talking climate change 40 years ago. My dad started talking about it in 54, but nobody was talking about it then. And now we see it all around us. We know it's there. My question is, what else is coming down the pipeline? We didn't know this was coming down at us 40 years ago. The great majority of people didn't know. What else? What other legacy of this abuse of the planet is shaping up right now to hit us next? And guaranteed there is something. This is a complicated little ecosphere we live on, and we've been abusing it for a long time. It's another argument for rewilding. Even if it's going to go to stuff we don't even know that we've done wrong yet, to try to get natural systems back. Later we can figure out what was about to come down and hit us. But people have got to understand, and they got to look around and realize that this is not just a bunch of environmentalists. It's what's happening. We're losing the planet, and we've lost so much of the biodiversity and the fecundity of this planet already. And there's people who just don't believe it. They don't understand the scale.
Well, let's bring it back to Point Reyes. What can people who are really hyped up now, they love what you said today, very, very concerned about what they've learned about this place that should not be in the situation that it is, what can they do to help make sure that it gets our full support?
Well, the public comment period closed in September, so that option is gone. But everybody who feels this way should write to their representative and their own congressman and write the National Park Service in Point Reyes and give your views, because this decision is being made right now, and it could come out any day, and they're aiming for the wrong decision. They're aiming to perpetuate ranching because, of course, it's inimical both to the principles of a national park. And this is one of the few, as you pointed out at the beginning, this is one of the few parks that does have grazing in it, and it needs to be eliminated.
All right, everybody, you've got your marching orders. Don't just sit there and be bummed out about stuff. Probably the best tonic to that I've ever found is going and writing a letter, taking some sort of action, and getting to work. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time to be on Rewilding Earth, and I definitely want to have you back. I want to have you back, especially when we've won this one, so we can just take a victory lap.
That's the spirit, and thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. We do what we do because of you. This podcast is supported by listeners like you who long to live in a wilder world. Please consider donating at rewilding.org and subscribe to our weekly news and article digest while you're there. To go the extra mile, you can follow and share Rewilding Earth on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Bonus points for sharing this podcast with your friends. To listen to past episodes, go to rewilding.org/pod. That's rewilding.org/pod.